event. First and foremost, thank you so much for joining us. We're so thrilled to have everybody with us today. Um, what I'm going to do is just kind of share some opening remarks about our speakers today and where the sort of origin of this online event is coming from. And to that end, my name is Christian Alvarado, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of California, Davis in African American and African Studies. And before that, I did my PhD in the History of Consciousness department at UC Santa Cruz. Um, I'm co-chair of the Global Memories Working Group, which I'll say a little bit more about in just a second here. And just a note before we get started, that all of our mics and cameras are going to be disabled until the Q&A portion. So don't worry if you're unable to access that portion now. When we get to the piece of the presentation where we open things up, you'll be able to both unmute yourself and show your video if you'd like to. So a quick word about the Global Memories Working Group. This working group explores the diverse and multi-directional ways in which memories travel across the globe. We try and think across local, transnational, and planetary scales in sort of theorizing and understanding this world of memory sort of formations that we loosely call global memories. So we're interested in how local contexts and movements are implicated in that structure of global memory, though we harbor a pretty critical approach to that terminology. This year, in our working group, we've had reparations as a kind of thematic that's been structuring our readings and work that we've been doing. So we've been kind of looking at this intersection of global memories and different reparations movements across the world. We're interested in both the theorization of this intersection by way of post-colonial studies, classics and memory studies itself, and historical theory, as well as the examination of cases and instantiations across the Caribbean, Africa, Europe, and the United States. And with regard to the US, that is sort of one of the structuring enterprises of today's session, where we are going to be speaking with and hearing quite a bit from members of the Reparations at U Chicago Working Group. So this is a group of scholars, activists, and community members dedicated to the pursuit of racial justice and reparatory demands, both in Chicago and beyond. And authored by our speakers today, among many other things, their work resulted in the groundbreaking article, A Disgrace to All Slaveholders, the University of Chicago's Founding Ties to Slavery and the Path to Reparations, first published in the Journal of African American History in 2018. So with that being said, I'm just going to say a few words about our speakers today, and then we'll move into the event proper. So I'm going to just start sort of arbitrarily with Jurula Wegner, my co-chair and founding member of the Global Memories Working Group. Dr. Wegner is a 100 Talents Young Professor of German and Comparative Literature at Zhejiang University in China. He's been visiting scholar at Columbia University, the University of Warwick, and the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. His work has been published in international journals such as Ariel, Caribbean Quarterly, Critical Arts, Journal of West Indian Literature, Memory Studies, and Wasafiri. His research interests include concepts of autobiography, carnival, critical theory, gender memory, postcoloniality, and world literature. So that's it for the Global Memories Working Group folks proper. And now I want to introduce our guests for today. I'll start with Dr. Guy Emerson Mount, who is fellow at the Carter G. Woodson Institute at the University of Virginia and an assistant professor in American History and African American Studies at Wake Forest University. He received his PhD at the University of Chicago in 2018 and previously served as an assistant professor of African American History at Auburn University. His current book manuscript, Slavery's Empire, Reconstruction of the Black Pacific, is scheduled to be peer-reviewed by Oxford University Press this year, and will be the first book-length study to narrate the end of American slavery in conjunction with the birth of America's overseas empire. Next, we have Dr. Kane Jordan. Dr. Jordan is a teaching fellow in the social sciences, race, diaspora, and indigeneity at U Chicago. He specializes in the history of medicine and African American history. Focusing on African American physicians in the Jim Crow North, his first project examined obstacles to their professional advancement, their development, and use of counter-institutions for professional and patient advocacy, as well as the creation of public health outfits for the distribution of care to disadvantaged communities. He earned his doctoral degree in history in 2024 at the University of Chicago. And last but by no means least, of course, we have Dr. Kai Parker, who is Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Virginia, where he teaches African American religious history. His book, City of Black Souls, Chicago, Ethiopianism, and the Black Apocalyptic Imagination, will be published in May 2025, this month, I should have edited, by University of Pennsylvania Press and is available for pre-order. In the book, Parker illuminates how Black Christians in Chicago use biblical representations of Ethiopia to connect Christian ideas of redemption to the fight against racism in the United States and imperialism in Africa from the late 19th to the mid 20th century. So, our speakers having been introduced, just to offer a very quick roadmap to how the session is organized. We're going to start with Guy, who's going to offer some framing thoughts about this intersection between the work of the RAUC and memory studies. After that, we'll hear from both Kane and Kai, who are going to offer their own thoughts. Urul and I will do a quick response. We'll have a bit of a roundtable, and then we'll have hopefully about 30 minutes for questions and answers. So all that being said, I'll go ahead and mute myself, and Guy, please feel free to take it away whenever you have the chance.
Okay, hopefully you guys can see me, and hopefully in a moment here, see my screen. You guys see my PowerPoint okay?
Yes, we can see it.
Peeking out, fantastic. So I will kind of start from here. And so just, yeah, thanks to everyone for putting this together. I mean, it's really, really fantastic what you guys are doing. And yeah, we are happy to really be here. So I wanted to open with a quote from Walter Rodney. Let me get this off my screen, actually. So this is Walter Rodney, for those who don't know, great kind of Guyanese scholar, activist in the Black radical tradition. He has a quote that's kind of been the guiding principle in many ways for what we're doing at The Rock. And it's that intellectuals are, quote, the enemies of the people until we prove otherwise. And I think when we think about that quote, the prove otherwise is really the critical part of this, right? Is that for much of academia, right, it ends up telling familiar narratives of existing power structures, and kind of the Black Studies 101 that I'm going to do in a moment here kind of compels us to think otherwise and to figure out a way in which we can, as intellectuals, prove that the work that we're doing is relevant to communities on the ground. And really having that scholarship kind of be driven from the bottom up is really kind of the starting point of where we started this work. And so I think all of us, though we're all trained at the University of Chicago as historians, as kind of, classically trained, as it were, Black studies, for those who kind of aren't familiar with it, is really where our fundamental sort of commitments lie with this work. And for those that want kind of a rundown, it's really the intellectual arm of the Black liberation struggle. And if you're kind of mapping a history of Black studies itself, we really trace it all the way back to slavery as this counter-hegemonic force against the kind of epistemic violence, against Black ways of knowing, Black thought, Black being, that slavery and as many afterlives has tried to kind of imbue in the world. Black studies kind of continues through the early professionalization of history as a discipline in the late 19th century. W.B. Du Bois, who is a whole kind of industry in terms of thinking about Du Bois and his role in like early sociology, early professionalization of the academy, and Black studies was kind of there from the beginning, as it were, as this counter hegemonic force. And obviously for most of us who know about Black studies and its kind of institutional move into the academy formally, this was accelerated during the campus protests of the 1960s and 70s. Came from students, came from scholars, came from activists who said, not so much that we wanted to be included within the academy, though that's often how this kind of gets narrated in our diversity, equity, and inclusion sort of ways. It really was a grassroots demand to revolutionize the academy, to undo the academy, overturn the academy, in some cases even destroy the academy and replace it with an emancipatory kind of mode of scholarship. So we don't come out of, and we don't come to this work as just another academic discipline or kind of another topic to be studied, but really we see Black studies and the work that we're doing as an anti-discipline, as this enduring critique of Eurocentric knowledge production, as ultimately a challenge to the triumphalism of European Enlightenment, Western modernity writ large. And it's an interdisciplinary approach that demands academic research situates itself within everyday Black political struggle. So before we even got to this work, this is kind of what we were swimming in, as it were. So a brief history of kind of how we got together and an institutional history of the ROC. So as Christian was saying, we started in 2017. It's important to note that this obviously grew out of both our academic and our activist work. This is a picture of Kane, who'll be joining us shortly. Some of the work that we were already engaged with prior to kind of coming together. We were involved in Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, Graduate Students United, which is the kind of pseudo labor union at the University of Chicago. There was a trauma center campaign where we were fighting for care and access to the level 1 trauma center at U Chicago that was being denied to residents on the south side of Chicago who were in traumatic injuries and were literally bleeding out as the university sent them elsewhere when they could have served them, and anti-eviction campaigns, etc. And then formally, because we come out of this tradition of Black studies, I was the coordinator of U Chicago's U.S. History Workshop. And so in an effort to kind of bring Black studies to that space, which traditionally is where people will workshop chapters and is very traditional and academic, we said that we wanted to have a session that didn't have that and was focused on thinking about universities and reparations, because we had seen some of the things that other American universities were doing. We were really kind of critical of a lot of the ways in which those reparations efforts or those just histories of slavery that universities were doing. We were very critical of how they were very top down, very not kind of attentive to community concerns. And so we tried to rethink it. And initially our thoughts were, they're thinking about slavery. We initially believed, oh, U Chicago is a pre-emancipation institution or a post-emancipation institution. The university says it started at 1890. And so we figured we could at least talk about, all the harms that U Chicago has done to Black communities since their founding. But as you'll see in a second, the university is actually much older than that. So anyway, we got together, a group of us said, we're interested, let's dig, let's see what we can find. We knew some things already about the university's ties to restrictive covenants. I know Kai's going to be talking about some of that later. But we started digging, and we found that the university actually predated their 1890 iteration. And so we published our findings in the Black Perspectives, which was important to us before we went to the journal to kind of reach out to the general public. And what happened is immediately Southside community organizations began reaching out to us. Organizations like NCOBRA, the Bronzeville Historical Society, Village Leadership Academy, Good Kids Mad City, anyone that's from Chicago or been to Chicago. There's an incredibly rich activist kind of tradition, an infrastructure of activism that is very well read, is very organized. And immediately we kind of were in the midst of, this was national, international news when we dropped that University of Chicago had ties to slavery. And to give an example of this, this is a photo of Sherry Williams, who is the president of the Bronzeville Historical Society. She's on the far right. And what we learned, and this is curious, once we thought we had broken some news, she contacted us and says, well, actually, since 2013, I've already been commemorating the enslaved peoples that made the University of Chicago possible. And by the way, there is a register of enslaved peoples at the University of Chicago's archives. Have you seen it? And we're like, no, we missed that. We haven't seen that yet. So there's the way in which community and our scholarship was working together with our activist work on the ground, where she's giving us information, we're giving her information. And that's a picture of her literally at Douglas's tomb site, where they're pouring libations to the commemorate and would read out the names of the enslaved peoples in order to commemorate them at Douglas's tomb. And we like to say on Douglas's tomb. And this is the register that she pointed us to. And it's in the University of Chicago's archives. The top left there, it actually says list of Negroes by family. So there's a real violence to this document, where the names of the enslaved peoples that, again, she would list out each and every one of them, 123 in total, pouring out African libations to them. In this document, there's an acknowledgement that these are families, right? These are complex kind of relationships and networks that the enslavers were aware of. But at the bottom line, to the right of those names, each and every name was a valuation, right? Was the chattel principle a person with a price? And this is what Douglas kept in his archives, and it's literally at the University of Chicago's special collections right now. Anyone can go view it. And so what about that history, and where does the University of Chicago come from? So as I mentioned, Stephen A. Douglas was actually the founder of the University of Chicago in 1856. He gave a 10-acre land donation to the university at 35th and Cottage Grove in Chicago. And he owned a 3,000-acre cotton plantation in Lawrence County, Mississippi. And on the bottom right is the map of part of that plantation, actually. And he had at least 123 enslaved peoples at the snapshot we were able to see, but the complexities of plantation life, people were coming, going, being bought, sold, etc. And at least one case broken up from their families. In terms of what that meant for Douglas, it meant that he was making approximately $500,000 per year in today's dollars from the profits of enslaved peoples. If that, in terms of rough valuations, that meant that land, the business as it were, was valued well over $5 million in today's terms. This really catapulted in many ways Douglas's own personal wealth. He's eventually going to become a U.S. senator, part of the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates. He's going to be a defender of slavery. Obviously, his slave owning is going to come up in his run for president, so he's going to run against Lincoln for the presidency. And he is pretty well known in Lawrence County, Mississippi, as a slaveholder. Now, the university is going to look at this and try to cut hairs. I'll talk about that in a moment. There's some particulars that I'm happy to kind of get into, and you can read the full article to kind of get that history. And today, if you look at the far right, he is buried under a 96-foot tall monument, which I'm told in meters is something like 29 meters. And this is just across the street from the original Bronzeville campus at 35th and Cottage Grove. And you can literally go see it today. And as you'll see, it's been the site of some of the activist work we've been doing. So as I mentioned, community immediately kind of rallied around us. So we start doing marches, protests, sit-ins, op-eds, panels, teach-ins, etc. We end up doing a march to President Obama's house. So folks might not know, but Barack Obama taught at the University of Chicago, has a home right around the corner from the University of Chicago within walking distance. So when we uncovered the university's ties to slavery, published them, we made these petitions to the administration and Barack Obama to acknowledge it, which they still haven't done. This actually on the far right is a march rally put on by R3. So this is the woman with the microphone is Barbara Ransby, legendary kind of first Detroit and now Black Chicago organizer that had us actually do a march. This was right after Charlottesville, and the people were killed in Charlottesville in that event. And we rallied at the Douglas Tomb and demanded reparations with a whole coalition of community organizations, labor unions, various grassroots activist organizations. And some of the other actions that we've kind of taken involve kind of NCOBRA. They have these laws in place that NCOBRA has put in local Chicago community to say that any organization that does business with the city of Chicago has to disclose its historical ties to slavery. And so University of Chicago has numerous contracts with the city of Chicago, and we try to use that law effectively to force the university to acknowledge, which they refuse to do. Graduates, I'm going to skip forward ahead and I kind of talk about all of these bullet points. Another thing you guys might be interested in participating in, we've had an ongoing Wikipedia warfare with the university about its founding date. Again, they're insisting that it's still 1890, and we insist that it's 1856. So feel free, anyone on this call or seeing this recording, go ahead and change it at will, and the university's representatives will quickly change it back, we will find. There's also a More Than Diversity campaign that I think Kane is going to talk about a bit later. And to skip ahead here, in the interest of time, We've done some disorientation work, kind of radical campus history tours. People in Chicago, especially older folks, still do a lot of radio listening. So we appeared on kind of radio talk shows, AM radio. And Kane's going to talk later about this Add an S campaign. We also went to the plantation and everything else. So how did the university respond to this? How did the wider communities respond to this? So of course, initially, anyone that does reparations work knows that there were immediately kind of right-wing death threats. Normally, we make a practice of not trying to participate in all male panels. And actually, we did have at least one female member at one point who, after seeing some of this, is like kind of got out of it. And so, yeah, I think it's important to note that it's not kind of riskless work, as it were. Fox News, Breitbart committed multiple kind of hit pieces. We dealt with angry alumni emails, at least 1 or 2 public outbursts where alumni would show up at our events and try to, discredit this. We were surveilled by the University of Chicago's administration. They previously had put undercover cops that were infiltrating kind of some activist events that we were at. And the U Chicago's administration continues to deny those ties to slavery, despite the fact that the slave register is in their very archives. And they basically are making they hired a third-party attorney or a third-party historian to kind of attempt to disprove our case. They also have attorneys on file with this, and they're trying to make this legalistic answer to what is effectively a moral demand. So what they've admitted to, and Kane will talk a little bit about this, is that, yeah, we have, well, they won't say we have ties to slavery, but they'll say Douglas had some ties to slavery, but Douglas, we have no ties to him. And Kane will kind of expose the lie there. But they're saying that was a previous iteration of the university. We're a new legal entity at this point. There are no connections materially or financially between them. All of these are completely untrue, very easily disproven, but this is what they're kind of going with. And it's really unique among American universities to have done this. Pretty much every other university has acknowledged their ties, done some kind of token gesture to at least investigate them, but University of Chicago, not so much. So Kane will talk a little bit about these forms of forgetting that I know your organization has been kind of thinking a lot about while they try to deny these ties. And that's where we are. So one of the ways, so what does this mean in terms of reparations and in terms of what's come out of this work, kind of a little bit on the level of theory, right? Well, the first thing that we think is that reparations are a process and not a policy, right? A lot of people there are certainly public policy implications to reparations, but what we see reparations as is an ongoing kind of horizontal, democratic, grassroots method for collectively confronting harm. So reparations, as we've kind of experienced it here, is this attempt to repair the irreparable. There's this sense as we go out and talk with community members, what should be done, what should happen here. It's that not everything can be fixed. There are harms here that can't be undone, but yet we should try. And theorists who have talked about reparations have said this is maybe a way to think about reparations as a rough justice, right? A rough way to repair the irreparable. So it places reparations both as a radical political demand historically, but also an everyday method of justice making. We see it as a revolutionary praxis. So we don't just theorize, we have to be in conversation with community and make reparations an ongoing revolutionary praxis. It's an exercise in Black world making. It's a way of being in the world. It's part of a permanent revolution. And we mean that both in the way that kind of Marx and then later Trotsky meant it, but also in a uniquely kind of reparative way, that if you're attempting to repair the irreparable, the work is never done, right? It's a permanent revolution in the society to undo these harms and ties to slavery. This is a quote from Adam Green, who looked at the work. He's a professor at University of Chicago, who said that what we have here is a durable demand. If the university continues to make its denials, the demand, the evidence itself is durable. It will continue. So it's a renewable, open source, activist resource that we've seen people from all over take up. And again, Kane will talk a little bit about how that's happened. For those of us with ancestral ties to slavery, this is a sacred trust for us, right? That peoples that were enslaved, who never had an opportunity to experience anything like repair. We have a trust and an obligation to those individuals. And if you go to any kind of Black-led reparations circle today, this idea of doing this for the ancestors, doing this for people who have passed on, doing it as a sacred trust. It becomes a language of liberation, an antidote to the carceral state, a kryptonite to racial capitalism, a vessel for the impossible, a container for the impractical, and something like an amber to protect the most radical Black freedom dreams, the things that can't be realized today, but can be tomorrow. So in the words of Ruth Wilson Gilmer, a great kind of abolitionist geographer, the good news is we only have to change one thing, everything. And so our vision of reparations and kind of what these implications of the university's ties to slavery are, is that university needs to change everything about how it kind of functions, needs to completely reorient itself and think about itself with those ties to slavery as a constant kind of why, a constant reason for being. And that's kind of what we're after. So here, I guess I will turn it over to Kai. I'm sure I ran over a tiny little bit, and Kai's going to kind of give us a little bit more about, the university's ties not just to slavery, but kind of that original project we were working on, which was their post-emancipation harms that they've done to Black Chicago.
Thank you so much, Guy. Can everyone hear me? Great. Thanks, Guy, and thank you all for this invite, and looking forward to hearing from Kane a little bit later. So yeah, as Guy was saying, I want to talk a little bit more about the relationship between what can be thought of as these two denials that the University of Chicago, has been engaged in for a very long time. And in some ways, they're twin denials, or even intertwined denials, or maybe even the same denial in one. And that is the denial of UChicago's roots in slavery. The UChicago is utterly founded in slavery, in its original formation, as Guy was talking about, and as our paper shows. And then also that UChicago has denied its role in innovating in many respects and perpetuating the extraordinary level of racial segregation surrounding the university on the south side of Chicago and in Chicago more broadly. And so I want to talk a little bit about how those are related and how the politics of the memory over UChicago's roots in slavery and over Stephen Douglas as the founder of UChicago still play a role in UChicago's ongoing involvement in the history and afterlives of racial segregation on the south side of Chicago. And so if you can see on the screen here, there's a map of a census tract of Chicago from 1934. And by 1934, African Americans had been living in Chicago for a very long time. There had been early communities of escaped formerly enslaved people who had been in Chicago in the 1860s. So Chicago was a kind of hotbed of runaway activity during the 1860s. In the early part of the 20th century, Black migration to Chicago from the then Jim Crow South increased until by 1940, there were perhaps about 230,000 African Americans in Chicago. And as you can see on the map, this is all Chicago. And yet, the overwhelming majority of Black people in Chicago lived just in this tiny strip of Chicago that was called the Black Belt, in the middle, essentially, of the south side of Chicago. And you can see a few more pockets on the north and then further to the south. But most Black people in Chicago just lived in this tiny kind of blackened section on the map. And this was not a natural occurrence. You know, often people argue that, well, the reason why why certain kinds of people seem to live in specific kinds of neighborhoods is because they naturally want to live with people who look like them or come from the same background as them. And that has often at times been the case. But in Chicago, the racial segregation of Chicago was a product of very deliberate policy and practice. And actually, the University of Chicago was centrally involved in that policy and practice. And so, Guy, do you have control of the thing? Can you just click on it? Oh, thank you. Great. Awesome. Okay, so this is a kind of zoom in from the slide that we were just looking at. And you can see this is from 1930. And so most African Americans in Chicago are living in this strip right down the middle of the south side of Chicago here. And as you can see, the main thoroughfare of Black Chicago during this period, South Parkway, runs right down the middle of this neighborhood. And after Martin Luther King's assassination, it was renamed Martin Luther King Boulevard. And somewhat ironically, King was an icon of integration, and yet this avenue remains at the center of what is still a very segregated community. Now, if you look right next to this concentration of African Americans, you can see that the UChicago campus is right next to this community. And as you can see, there are hardly any Black people living in 1930 in this whole area right around University of Chicago. And yet you can see how concentrated Black people were just a few blocks to the west of University of Chicago. And so this was not by accident. This was a very deliberate practice. And one of the things that University of Chicago did was blanket the neighborhoods surrounding UChicago in what were called restrictive covenants. Houses were sold with deeds that showed that you could not sell the property to African Americans. And also the UChicago organized a lot of homeowners organizations to oppose African Americans moving into this area. And the city would largely support these measures for a variety of reasons. The UChicago would often threaten to move out of the city of Chicago if its demands for racial segregation were not upheld and reinforced by the city. And so UChicago has been very central in the rise of segregation in Chicago. And Guy, can you click on the slide one more time? Thank you. As you can see here, we're in 1960. By 1960, the population of the African-American population of Chicago has increased from, say, 230,000 in 1940 to over 1 million by 1960. And yet most people are still living largely in the same area that they had been before, but you can see that University of Chicago is still surrounded by areas, some of which are becoming more Black, but you can still see that to the east here, this remains a overwhelmingly non-Black part of the city, even though the rest of the south side of Chicago around it is becoming more and more Black. And so the University of Chicago became a kind of bastion of white control and demographic preeminence, even as the rest of the city around it became more Black, because African Americans were still being confined largely to this part of the south side of Chicago. And yet the University of Chicago has often denied its role in this history. And this denial is actually connected to the denial of the university's foundation in slavery and the denial of its connection to its founder, Stephen Douglas. So let's see, for the rest of the time I have, I know we're running close to the period that we're supposed to be moving into Q&A soon. So I just want to be very brief and say that the relationship between the memory of Stephen Douglas as the founder of the University of Chicago and UChicago's engagement in segregation since the 20th century is very complicated. It's very complicated, in part because if we go back to the rise of the Hyde Park campus of the University of Chicago, the new campus. The new campus was actually founded under an attempt to remake the image of the university into a kind of abolitionist or neo-abolitionist institution. John D. Rockefeller, the famous robber baron, was central to the inauguration of the Hyde Park campus. And one of the reasons why the campus is in Hyde Park is because, and it's where it currently is located, is because there was a fight between the folks who were involved with the university in its old Douglas campus, who still identified with Stephen Douglas as the rightful founder, and the folks who were involved in moving the campus to Hyde Park, who wanted to distance the university from Douglas and claim more of an abolitionist legacy. And actually, when John D. Rockefeller was growing up, he actually wrote essays, abolitionist essays, against the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was the act that Stephen Douglas was famous for promoting in Congress, and basically was an act that was trying to expand slavery, essentially, in the United States. And so for Rockefeller and for others of his ilk, it was very important to sever the new campus from the legacy of Douglas, not only as someone who had owned slaves and whose slave owning was central to the foundation of the university, but also as someone who was arguably the central, if somewhat indirect instigator of the Civil War and of the conflict between the North and the South over the question of slavery. And so the university actually hired faculty, particularly a famous German historian, Edmund von Holst, who in his famous history of the politics of the United States, labeled Stephen A. Douglas a traitor, essentially, to the United States. He called Stephen Douglas Stephen A. Douglas, Stephen Arnold Douglas, with an emphasis on the Arnold. And by that he meant that Stephen Arnold Douglas, Arnold was his middle name, he was tying Douglas to Benedict Arnold, who's kind of the famous embodiment of treachery and treason in US history for his basically leaving the Revolutionary Army and joining the British during the American Revolution. And so there was this very deliberate attempt to sever the university from its pro-slavery past by embracing this kind of abolitionist stance. And it gave the university also, during an era in which questions of academic objectivity were at such a premium, it gave it a kind of intellectual credibility. You know, the idea that the university would actually hire a famous scholar who had lampooned and vilified and denigrated its founder suggested that UChicago was no longer this kind of Baptist institution that had certain kinds of religious ways of seeing the world, but actually had embraced a kind of secular objectivity that was right for a kind of cutting edge, empiricist, objective university. However, and then I'll just briefly conclude with this, however, the University of Chicago became famous in the early 20th century for its sociology department, which often is called the Chicago School of Sociology. And the Chicago School of Sociology actually had a very different relationship with Stephen Douglas, because the Chicago School actually found itself aligned itself with what's often called the Dunning School of Historians. The Dunning School of Historians basically were these historians who wrote that the attempt to enfranchise freed African Americans after the Civil War was a mistake. And the Chicago School of Sociology in the early 20th century actually aligned its thought with the Dunning School in order to resist the ongoing and increasing Black migration of African Americans from the South to the North. And so the Chicago School of Sociology actually used a kind of Jim Crowist politics and even epistemology in some ways in order to resist ongoing Black migration during this period and in the early 20th century. And at this time, there was actually a big effort to rehabilitate Stephen Douglas, that these academics were very kind of connected to. And so during this period, actually, these academics actually were part of this movement to reclaim Douglas as a kind of righteous patriot and as the rightful founder of UChicago. And so you can still see evidence of people connected to U Chicago, claiming Douglas as the founder into the 20th century. And so while the connections between the sociologists and the policies of restrictive covenants and the other kind of segregationist policies are complicated, there is overlap there that connects the battle over the politics of the memory of Stephen Douglas as the founder with the attempt to segregate the South Side of Chicago around the University of Chicago campus. So with that, I'll end there and I will turn things over to Kane.
Hello, everyone. First and oh wait, can you move to the next slide? First and foremost, thank you so much for coming. I'll be speaking about 3 instances of our work making it into the community or eliciting a response, in many ways, the afterlives of our piece. So, add an S, it's for the best. This was the catchline for the campaign of the Village Leadership Academy's Add an S campaign. In 2017, the Reparations at U Chicago Working Group visited the students at the academy. The working group told them a bit of history about the neighborhood that both they and the school they attended resided in. Of chief relevance was our mention of Stephen Douglas's ties to slavery, the very same Stephen Douglas who was the namesake of the park many of the students had been enjoying for their entire lives. One Academy student, Aaron Peterson, shared his feelings, stating, "If your park is named after a slaveholder and your neighborhood is predominantly Black, that's really offensive to your people. It's really important to take what's going on in your community seriously. The park you play in, it has a really big impact on yourself." This became part of a larger argument the students would advance in their campaign. That is, with the neighborhood of North Lawndale being 87% Black, they should not be subjected to the lionizing of an individual that profited from slavery. Following our 2017 visit, they launched their quote-unquote Add an S campaign, and they pulled out all the stops. Next slide. The students held marches. Oh, actually, the slide after, sorry. The students held marches, rallies, and informational gatherings to galvanize the community, met with the alderperson, brought their demands to city council meetings, and they even had an Instagram page to get the word out. Their profile picture boldly stating, "No parks named after slave owners." They even created a GoFundMe with the help of former teachers, raising over $15,000 so they could continue their efforts in earnest. They went strong for several years and campaigned vociferously for what they believed in. At the beginning of 2020, however, they were right up against a brick wall. Their momentum stalled. Next slide. That is until someone decided to take the quote-unquote Add an S campaign to the next level in February 2020, literally adding an S to the park signage, in a whimsical and radical twist. A Chicago alderman, when asked about the apparent change, remarked that although he didn't condone writing on the signs, because it's not technically legal, few people in the community would lose sleep over this slight to Douglas. Quote, "He was a sympathizer of slavery. It is wrong to have the name of somebody who had apathy towards slavery to be the name of a park that all these people of color use and frequent every day. I feel no remorse for them doing that," end quote. In July of that year, shortly following the murder of George Floyd and the wave of protest that swept the globe, the Chicago Park District Board of Commissioners began the process of removing the Douglas name from the park with actually very little fanfare. And in November of that year, it would be made official. The board president remarked, "We as a board are impressed by your determination and your refusal to take no as an answer. You are to be commended for being ahead of the curve by a long way. And next slide, sorry. Little Renaya Johnson said this after their victory. Our work has set a historic precedent for years to come. For the first time since the park was founded in 1869, it will reflect a legacy rooted in resistance, liberation, and freedom. The park will no longer bear the name of a slaveholder or white supremacist. Now, Black boys and girls like me can walk around the park knowing it is named after freedom fighters like Anna and Frederick Douglass. Speaking of getting slaveholders out of places, let's talk about stones and plaques. Slide. This is a plaque in the dining hall, Hutchinson's Commons, in 1901, commemorating Stephen A. Douglas. Slide. In 1927, the University of Chicago installed this stone from its original Bronzeville campus onto the Classics building. In July 2020, as you can see from the second picture, the provost of the University of Chicago, Robert Zimmer, unbeknownst to most of the campus, including many in the administration, faculty, staff, and students, removed the Douglas memorabilia from the campus in the dead of night when the campus was largely cleared due to the summer vacation and COVID fears. Zimmer asserted in his email to the U Chicago student body that the relics were removed because, quote, Douglas does not deserve to be honored on our campus, end quote. President Zimmer presented this act as an end in itself, quote, toward building a stronger, more inclusive University of Chicago, end quote, while at the same time denying any accountability for Douglas's crimes against humanity. In our original piece on Douglas, the University of Chicago, and slavery, we pointed to the stone and plaque as key indicators of connection between the University of Chicago's Hyde Park and original Bronzeville campus. However, those were far from the only connections, as over 5,000 library books in the current collection came from the original campus. The Alumni Donor Network, crucial, as we know, to any university survival, and the professors and administrators, you get the point. But what did their removal accomplish? More than likely, not what the administration thought it might, I imagine. Next slide. Later that year, largely in response to the murder of George Floyd and the removal of the Douglas stone and plaque that no one asked for, Black faculty led an effort in consultation with the Reparations at U Chicago Working Group, demanding divestment from campus police, increased funding and autonomy for the Center for Race, Politics, and Culture, faculty control over diversity initiatives, a new Department of Critical Race Studies, and reparations at the University of Chicago. They called for a partial faculty strike against all university-led DEI initiatives and called on scholars to forego speaking and other kinds of engagements at the university until their demands were met. Black graduate students, including myself, were on administrative duty, also spreading the word and collecting pledges and signatures from graduate students and also from other faculty who agreed with the campaign. The efforts were somewhat successful, with the Department of Critical Race Studies becoming a reality in the Department of Race, Diaspora, and Indigeneity, the department at the university where I now have the pleasure of teaching. Next slide. Our piece is quoted in the reparations section of the demands, speaking to the afterlife of our work. Next slide. It has also been featured in student orientation pamphlets and carried on by student groups on campus, such as the University of Chicago Against Displacement, which, like our organization before it, has called for reparations for slavery. I look forward to the afterlives that our work will assume in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Guy, Kai, and Kane. That's really great. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for the audience who joins us. I have just a very short response to what the group is doing. I'm titled it "The University as a Site of Reparatory Justice," and you will see in a moment that I'm giving it a little bit of a twist. The Caribbean historian Hilary Beckles emphasizes universities' complicity with slavery. The enslaved throughout colonial America and in imperial Europe, he writes, constituted a subject that preoccupied thought leaders in their roles as shapers of public opinion and as private and corporate investors. The British philosopher John Locke, Beckles continues, was extremely influential in legitimizing and incorporating transatlantic slavery as the bedrock of British investment in human property. Through theoretical justifications, financial investments, and institutional leadership, universities thereby offered intellectual and material support to the enslavement and trade of Africans. This is also the case for universities across the Americas, as Beckles contends. Their institutional roles were to reproduce an effective slave-owning class and sustain the economies they managed. Kine Jordan, Guy Emerson Mount, and Kai Perry Parker furthermore show that some universities are more deeply entangled in this history than others. At Yale University's enslavers donated buildings, and at Georgetown University, enslaved African Americans were sold to continue its operations. The University of Chicago, however, is rooted even deeper in the history of enslavement. They write, as slavery didn't merely benefit the University of Chicago, slavery created it. They highlight this university's foundation in African Americans' enslavement. Beckles describes the paradox that institutions of higher learning are rooted in some of humanity's cruelest history, and nonetheless he sees this as a source of hope. He writes, the realization that spaces that were once fields of violence, but now classrooms for discourses about humanity's finer values, constituting the richest imaginable sites for learning and teaching, has been politically empowering. Jordan, Mount, and Parker trace the many material, institutional, and psychological traces connecting Stephen A. Douglas's plantation wealth to the University of Chicago, from books to bricks and professorships to the university's notoriously nerdy and quirky culture, giving its unofficial motto, where fun goes to die, a very different twist. The three scholar activists, however, highlight this horrible past to effect change. Historian Catherine Hall suggests how a cruel past may enable reparatory futures. Although she focuses on the abolition of slavery's bicentenary commemoration, she offers insights into universities' relation to reparatory justice. In the debate surrounding the commemoration, Hall writes, there was no common view, but many voices were raised, unsettling what had seemed to be settled narratives. And this, she argues, was a reparative moment, making new discoveries and provoking new questions. One might argue that what is enabled in this time of commemoration, the university institutionalizes even more effectively. University classrooms often enable that voices unsettle seemingly settled narratives. Beckles might be seeing this potential as a source of hope to rise above the past. Yet, what propels this unsettling of narratives? Here, Jordan, Mount, and Parker argue that it is not the university and not just students' questions and protests. Considering the Reparations at University of Chicago working group, they write, central to this process of reparatory justice is community involvement, community repair, and transforming the institution itself to prevent future harm. They highlight the importance of creating awareness, building coalitions, and continuing conversations among affected communities and beyond. This, I believe, is a form of commemoration that reveals how slavery affects the present. In the Global Memories Working Group, we came up with 3 ways in which reparatory justice relates to memory. First, memories in reparatory justice are the fundamental work of identifying and addressing the ways in which reparatory justice still awaits realization, from apologies to monetary payments, curing inheritable diseases, and more. This focuses on aspects requiring reparations. The second level, memories of reparatory justice, describes efforts to publicize, commemorate, and disseminate the need for reparatory justice. It includes monuments, museums, and artworks just as the ROC's work of organizing grassroots movements, political collectives, and transnational alliances. These intensify remembrance of the need for reparatory justice. The third level, reparatory justice as memories, self-reflexively investigates how remembrance on the first, second, and third level operates. It includes research concerning the history of reparatory justice, how it is remembered, and how one case inspires another's. While all three levels are important, Jordan, Mount, and Parker highlight the crucial role of the second level, conscious acts of commemorating, propelling reparatory justice claims. So that's me trying to somehow understand what you were doing. I have one question. I will keep it very short. This tension, it seems to me, is shown in your self-descriptions as scholar activists. So my question is, and it's in a way a big one, what challenges, tensions, and opportunities does this twofold role present to you in terms of scholarship and activism? How do both aspects feed in one another, right? And you can go into that, pick an aspect. I think there are many things to talk about, but I'll hand now over to Christian.
Thank you so much for that, Jarula, and thank you so much, Kai, Kane, and Guy, for all of this, your thoughts on this wonderful presentation. I'm conscious of the clock, and so I'm going to keep my own remarks, very, very brief. I'm hoping that what we can do after that is just have some quick responses to the things that maybe Jarula and I have brought up, and then we can just go ahead and move into the larger Q&A if that's all right with everyone. As I was hearing this, and I had some things that I had planned on saying that I think I'm actually going to hold off on, because one of the things that struck me so powerfully, I think hasn't yet been, or it's definitely been underscored, right? But I wanted to re-underscore is, Kai's mentioning of this kind of two denials, right? University of Chicago's roots in slavery, right, as well as the denial of its role in innovating and perpetuating, right, and that these are two deeply entwined things. One of the things that I think is so interesting about that and so powerful about that as a way of kind of theorizing this problem space is that it speaks to me I think it speaks to this kind of confusion of geographies of memories of slavery that kind of it's taking to actually do this work, right? And what I mean by that is that the question of where memory of slavery is possible seems very much at stake here, right? And very much to be a site of contestation between the institution, the community, and everybody else who's kind of sort of brought into this space, right? And I think we can see very clearly the institutional denial of why this is the case in the University of Chicago, right? This very conscious sort of adoption of being an abolitionist university and cultivation of a certain kind of memory culture, right? And I think we can also think about it more broadly, right? How memory of slavery is possible, or rather differently possible in certain places, seems to me to be very operative here, right? Like, memory of slavery in Chicago would be a framework that, I think some people have worked on in terms of, say, like the Great Migration, perhaps, and individual and familial memory and things like this, right? But tends to be disregarded or marginalized, right, when it comes to these questions of institutional histories and memory cultivation, right? And I think that's such an important aspect that this work brings out, because it really asks us to reconsider, I think, questions of scale in a really foundational way when it comes to memory formations regarding not just slavery, but any number of phenomena, right? As well as relations of place itself. I think one of the reasons that this takes on such a pronounced tenor is precisely some of the things that everybody here was underscoring, right? That this is a project that emerges out of community memory, right? Not just university based research in kind of the stricter sense. And, I think as we kind of broaden out it, thinking through that space, one of the things I wanted to invite you to do is also to talk a little bit about kind of the transnational memory dynamics and connections between some of this work. I know you all have worked quite a bit and interfaced with different international organizations and organizing around reparatory justice. So now I just want to give you a few minutes to kind of respond to I think these are to a certain extent like quite linked questions, right? But Yarula's query about the tensions and opportunities that being a scholar activist kind of offers, right? As well as what that means as this broadens out into maybe the global in a kind of more simple sense of what we might mean by that. So anyway, I'll open it up to you three. And then after y'all have had a chance to think through that a little bit, we'll go ahead and open it up to everybody else.
I think this is usually where we would huddle up if we were in person. We would decide who does what. This is our modus operandi. But I guess to maybe go to the first question in terms of scholar activism. I would say I don't think it's a problem for Black studies in its purest form. I think it is a problem in terms of the tension between scholarly work and activist work. I think it's very well integrated in the early genesis of Black studies. I think it is a problem for the academy. It's a huge problem for the academy because obviously activist work is seen as, if you can see this as polemical. You can see it as something that's, not theoretically grounded. Kai and I and Kane, we talked about, hey, should we hit him with Lacan? Should we do some Derrida? Like, how should we, we said, no, this is not, we can work in that register. We can function in that register. And so there's a certain kind of code switching that I think in Black studies we do. And we're, when we need to do that, we do that. But when we are at our kind of happy place, as it were, right, it's within Black studies. And I think that remains a problem for the academy, but not a problem so much for Black studies, except for the increasing professionalization of Black studies and the ways in which, the current generation of scholars coming into the academy see the professorship as just another job, effectively, right? A career pathway, a lot of careerism and this sort of thing. And people are removed from some of that activist work. And there's a little bit of a tension, I would say, within Black studies itself as to holding on to that scholar activist model, and those that are kind of trying to abandon it, institutionalize it, and effectively do sort of an integrationist sort of thing, and forget the fact that Black studies is here to challenge the academy, challenge its epistemological kind of origins. Why are we talking about Derrida? Why are we talking about Foucault? Why are we not talking about African griots? Why are we not talking about Du Bois and others? So that's how I would address the scholar activist thing in broad terms.
Those are really wonderful questions. And I think one place where I think these two questions maybe come together is there's something about the question of the local activism in Chicago that does, in part because of its geographical location and not just the location, but the symbolism of that location. I mean, Chicago, Illinois in general is thought of as the land of Lincoln, land of Abraham Lincoln, the center of the anti-slavery political force. Douglas is largely known as someone who lost the Lincoln-Douglas debates. He's kind of the bad guy of the debates. But people often don't know a lot about how central he was in building pro-slavery and expansionist kind of imperialist slavery ideology, in part because he's from Illinois, and it just kind of cognitively is hard to understand even now how that politics worked. But I think in part, as an academic, I mean, one of the things that maybe connects these two things is that engaging in activism, I think, is something to be taken with a good dose of epistemic humility, in terms of not being necessarily the leaders in these kinds of situations, having folks who are much more familiar with these neighborhoods often than we are, who have kinds of knowledges that we do not have, very sophisticated, but just different kinds of knowledges that we need to be accountable to and be working with. And it's not for us to be kind of commandeering this project. And so we're, been very happy when folks have taken this work and used it to engage in whatever kinds of, as Kane was showing, just whatever kinds of campaigns that they are engaging in ways that we are just not really able to do. And that's a good thing, actually. And that, as Guy was saying, that is very much in tune with Black studies and with its kind of bottom up values that go back to the 60s and really beyond. The Du Bois would often indicate that that academic work, work studying Black people is not just about, say, philosophizing history or the critique of pure reason. It's about what he called the Negroes of Farmville, these Black folks in this small rural Virginia area who were in a place so anonymous it's called Farmville. And yet it's actually studying communities like that you can actually glean these kind of broader theories about critiquing the various worldly operations and whatnot. So yeah, I guess I'll pass it off to Kay now.
Yeah, I don't actually have much to add because like all of that was very good. But yeah, one thing I will say is that um kind of as Guy alluded to, there's a tension between sort of scholar and activist, like that hyphenated word for a couple of reasons. Especially, one being the quote that that Guy sort of read from Walter Rodney in terms of the way in which sort of scholars have and scholars and their scholarship have historically been weaponized, against working class communities and communities of color. Um, and the second part is that um, being a scholar activist is not necessarily incentivized, especially depending on the institution. So, I mean, like you're not, if you go to like a march or rally, is that really going to be in your tenure file? Probably not. So that's the other thing is that uh, some institutions value the work that people are doing more than others. And in some cases there's just like sort of just a crackdown, in terms of sort of dissenting views, which would arise from activism. And the other part is, and the third is, what has to do with sort of the work that, and the balance that you have to find between the work that you do and actually pounding pavement, actually being on the ground, actually listening to people. Um, because, you want to be able to leverage your particular position to be able to sort of bring about particular change. And in order to do that, you have to sort of exist within a particular institution. But on the other hand, that sort of takes away from the time that you could be sort of doing a bit more sort of community organizing. So to me, like there are just sort of those three particular tensions that sort of that tend to be sort of wound, in on themselves.
Thank you three so much for those excellent responses. So at this point, I believe that we'd like to turn it over to general Q&A from folks in the audience. So Katarzyna, I know that I believe that folks are going to be unmuted at a certain point. So if you do have a question, please go ahead and raise your hand, and we'll go ahead and start taking questions from everybody here.
And maybe while we're waiting, or if people are collecting their thoughts, a quick addendum to this with regards to Douglas. One of the things we didn't mention is that one of the places that this work went was to the State House at the state of Illinois, where Douglas had a portrait of him that's since been removed as a result of this work. So in terms of like the memory work, right, that's another aspect of this that, yeah, I think is important to throw in there.
Yeah, I agree with that. And there's there's also, based on the campaign that the students of the Village Leadership Academy did, there was an Alderman Scott, I believe, looked into what the actual name of the neighborhood that they were that he one of the neighborhoods that he was the sort of alderman of, what that was, what the name of that was, and it was actually called Douglas. So he's actually sort of working on a project, basically trying to trying to change that name, because now that the park now that the park's name has been changed, he wants, the any sort of, what is it called, any sort of mention of this person to be sort of ripped out root and branch. um
And see, I didn't even know that. I'm literally hearing about that now. So this is our let 1,000 flowers bloom kind of methodology, right? The idea that these things can ripple, and you kind of want to make space for that work to ripple in ways that are unexpected and frankly often more interesting than what you might have envisioned, So yeah, that's another interesting ripple.
Thank you. It looks like we do have a question from the audience. Dr. Athena, will you go ahead and unmute yourself and go ahead whenever you're ready?
Hello, good evening. Good evening, all of you. Yes, first time I'm meeting Jarula, sir. Good evening, sir. Thank you for sending us the invite. Hello, sir. Thank you for sending me this invite. I have joined this meeting very late, but still I haven't I want to know few things about the reparative justice. This is a forum, right? I wanted to know what would be the policy recommendations that could be given to ensure or to support the implementation of this reparative justice, be it of any country, but what could be the policy recommendation this forum could give? Yes.
Thank you, Doctor. Yes, so anybody who would like to respond to maybe some of the policy implications in a little more depth than you already have addressed would be great.
So I know I've given a talk at a public policy event called Reparations is Not a Public Policy. And I don't mean that there are no public policy implications, but I think part of what a lot of the back to some of the critiques we had of early university kind of efforts and what Kane was describing in terms of how the university has approached it. They have approached it kind of as public policy, or as, if we just do a policy, if we just do a thing, we can effectively bury the memory, bury the history, not make a gesture towards reparations, right? And some kind of commemoration, some kind of symbolic thing. American universities, it's statues, it's monuments, it's plaques, it's, at the University of Virginia, they have, done this elaborate thing. They spent millions of dollars on it, but the actual things that communities wanted were left by the wayside. And that's because reparations was conceptualized as a public policy rather than as an ongoing revolutionary kind of process and praxis, right? A way in which communities can have a horizontal democratic space in order to decide what has happened, who has been harmed, and what constitutes repair of that harm. So kind of reparations 101, and there are many frameworks of reparations in the more practical sense, one of which is like, let's say, the United Nations framework, right? Which there have a whole set of kind of procedures and ways of organizing reparations. And there's a whole bunch of them, one of which is cessation of current harms, for example, right? Which I think in the case of Chicago, as Kai is mentioning, there's ongoing harms that the university is doing in terms of gentrification, pushing people out of communities, over policing. One of my students was shot by the University of Chicago's police force while he was enrolled in my class one day literally the next day he's shot by the university police. Ceasing that, right? So secession is reparative, right? Stopping harm is, preventing future harm is reparative. But making sure that there are new kind of transformations in the institutional structure to prevent that is critical. But it's communities themselves that need to kind of, has to be driven by grassroots needs, grassroots demands, and grassroots kind of efforts. Otherwise, if you have this top-down kind of policy that gets imposed on communities, it doesn't work. People revolt. It's not going to function. It's not going to meet the needs of people who have been harmed. And that really is reparations 101. Harm has been happened. And communities have the responsibility to kind of dictate terms, as it were, decide what it should be, when it's enough, how much it's enough. And so I think we've conceptualized various kind of community forums. We kind of try to just put those in practice by having open forums, places where communities can dialogue, make demands on the administration, and then just do things. I mean, that's the great thing about adding the F's, right? If the state, if the university, if they're not going to respond, somebody, and again, statute of limitations is probably not up, so we won't say who, but like somebody just takes it upon themselves to do the reparations, right? So it's not just those who have done the harm or institutions that have committed the harm that can participate in healing the harm. It's also communities coming together, rallying, and filling in that space when institutions refuse to participate or acknowledge what they've done. So we see it as kind of a dynamic process and something that is open, is fluid, and is frankly new in world history, right? Humanity is just kind of thinking about and figuring out how to do this on a grand scale in one sense. But in another sense, every indigenous society I've ever looked at has some indigenous method of reparative justice, right? Whether it's Polynesia, I've talked to people in Iceland, I've talked to people kind of all over the world, and I always ask them, what is your method of repair, right? What in your culture, your tradition, and it's all over the place, from Ubuntu philosophy in Africa, and all of that is kind of in play. And I think we need to tap into those indigenous ways of knowing, right? And then also kind of think through kind of modern political, geopolitical sorts of questions.
Thank you for that,
Thank
Guy.
you so much. Thank you.
Yeah. And just a quick reminder, if you have a question, raise your hand. But this emphasis on just doing something, and to a certain extent, maybe moving away from a policy orientation, also strikes me as something that is very pertinent to things that something that I think is on a lot of people's minds right now in this space, which is, just doing something as opposed to working in a policy forward manner. Policies can be rolled back. Policies at the whim of an administration, at the whim of a state, can be reversed or eliminated or what have you. And I just wanted to also offer up a little bit of space here to maybe talk about the shifting dynamics that you all have confronted. Presumably, I suppose this was published during the first Trump administration. We've now been through a different presidential administration. Now we're back in the Trump administration. Policy orientation becomes a very sort of fraught thing in that kind of political churn, right? So anyway, I'm just curious to hear a little bit if you're open to talking about what this has kind of meant across different time periods and at least federal orientations toward national policy and things like that.
One thing that I'll briefly say about that is I think that underscores the importance of this bottom-up orientation of the idea of reparations and this emphasis on communities. We're learning that it turns out that the academy is more vulnerable than maybe people thought to all kinds of state and other kinds of machinations, and that's all the more reason to have kind of a more diffuse, more community-rooted approach in a lot of ways, so that things are not as vulnerable to the forms of state capture that exist within academic spaces in ways that maybe we weren't even as aware of as we are now. And then I think this also brings up the point that Christian mentioned in relation to the international question, that much of the fight around questions around the politics of the U.S. Academy are rooted around these questions of nationalism. And sometimes there's an attempt to suggest that reparations is a way for say, the United States to heal itself from the sin of slavery or something along those lines. And thinking more transnationally at the outset, so to speak, can also be a way of challenging these kind of nation-centered frames, which of course neither reflect the actual historical phenomenon of slavery or of segregation or of gentrification, all of which are profoundly international policies, and policies and also prevent reparations from falling into the ideological capture that can be represented by these national frames, which suggests that what's to be repaired ultimately is not so much the harm that's done in a more specific sense, but rather the harm that's done to the kind of national reputation, and that ends up being what becomes foregrounded. So in that sense, yeah, I mean the emphasis on communities and the turn away from these forms of both state and ideologically nationalist capture that we're now learning are more powerful maybe than we realized the first time around.
Just checking out, it looks like we maybe have time for one or two more questions, but in the meantime, while folks are maybe thinking about that, Kane, I see you shaking your head. If you want to add anything, feel free, but no pressure.
Just wanted to say that it's awful. Like it is just, I mean, it's funny, like before you had said that we had started this in the first Trump administration and we're like still doing this in the second, I was like, it had like escaped my mind for a minute that we were under authoritarian rule. It's because we're talking about like, such revolutionary work. But yeah, no, I think one thing that because I think that everything that I really echo everything that that Kai said and that Guy said in terms of the transnational implications of of in how we should be thinking about how we should be sort of thinking about and sort of considering repair. That exactly right, that it should not be just sort of nation centered, that it shouldn't be imbued with like this this way to sort of save the country, this sort of jingoist sort of this patriotism, um that that it, and in fact if we're doing it right, it's as Guy kind of alluded to, it would actually disrupt the nation state.
Thank you so much for that. I think probably our last question that we'll have time for, but Pedro, I see you have your hand up. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask whatever you'd like.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Pedro from University of Ibadan. My question is the reparation of historical the demand for historical justice, and I'm asking for reparation. How successful has it been over the years? The community that wants to be represented, are there how will I say it, classes of people that believe, oh, let's forget the past and move on, or let's seek demand for historical justice from the government? How will this historical justice be carried out? That's usually my own dilemma. Is it by payment or like renaming of public monuments like you've shown us during your presentation? Are there other ways that you need the public needs to address or be aware of, that other forms in which reparation can take place, that people feel like some sort of historical justice had happened? Thank you.
So I teach a course on the long history of reparations, and kind of not just for slavery, but for again, these indigenous ways of knowing, but also the ways in which it's developed within international frameworks. Starting, well, there's a lot of different starting points, right? But in terms of the quote unquote successes, I mean, one of the big takeaways most students take from that class is that there are a lot of attempts to do reparations for, let's say major crimes against humanity that have been attempted. Let's say the Holocaust. Let's say some of the case studies they use, obviously the Holocaust. There's the Japanese internment reparations that happened in the United States. There's the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And all of these, when you really start to dig into the weeds, they really end up doing some of the things that Kai was talking about, right? They end up reifying certain nation states, reifying colonial projects, reifying kind of systems of racial capitalism, right, and the methods in which that they're put forward. So let's say, one of the things we hear oftentimes, which is not, it is a genuine community demand, but it's one that we don't necessarily share, it wouldn't be on the top of our list for remedies, is people will say, like, for example, support Black businesses. The government should support Black businesses because it took away land, labor, et cetera, in different moments, which again, comes from the community, it's democratic, we kind of have to contend with that. But what that ends up doing is keeping a system of harm in place, i.e. racial capitalism that's causing the harm. And so the remedy itself ends up actually entrenching the harm. And those are things I think we really need to be kind of aware of and cognizant of as we're looking for it. The other part of your question that I want to take is the idea of, are there successes? What has been happening? Here's what's interesting, and maybe to bring it back to the Trump administration. There's been a proliferation in the United States that has not even been covered in most of the US press, much less the European press, in which local grassroots efforts, exactly the kind we had hopefully envisioned, that have there are several hundred local, statewide, regional, at the provincial kind of level that are taking shape all over the United States. There's an annual conference, and if anyone wants to look this up, there's an organization called First Repair that's by Robin Rue Simmons, who was the alderwoman in the city of Evanston, Illinois, which is just to the north, the first city to the north of Chicago. She actually initiated one of the only and the first, well, not the only at this point, but the first local reparations project in the United States, in which, because of the history of racial segregation in the city of Evanston, she was able to convince the Evanston City Council to vote for her and allocate $25,000 per Black homeowner to be allocated towards repairing the harm that housing segregation has caused. So it was a matchup between the harm that had happened on the level of housing and funding that would go to literal cash dollars. They distributed, I think, $5-6 million, something like that, and have their own funding source. And now they're raising money from philanthropy. So it's kind of a success story. There's a documentary on this that's been done that I want to say is called, oh man, I can't believe it's escaping me at the moment. But if you Google Robin Rue Simmons documentary, Evanston, Illinois, you'll see it. There's a whole kind of chronicling of that history. And that's been, people have been trying to replicate that ever since. And there are various projects, panels, harm reports, and things that have taken shape. So that's in the midst of the Trump administration. And one of my arguments there is, if you really want to upset Trump, do local reparations. Right, do local reparations initiatives now, because it's something local communities in, let's say, not Trump sort of cities can do at the local level, that will be experimentations happening all over the country, that once Trump is out of office, and we're talking national or international reparations, you've got a bunch of experimentations that are taking shape. And that's already just happening organically in community. And so I think, yeah, that's something to keep an eye on. Again, it's all local news kind of coverage. But First Repair is the one mapping that and kind of trying to network all those local grassroots efforts together at this point. And Chicago's doing it as well. The city of Chicago has its own local reparation.
Thanks so much for that, Guy. Oh, sorry, Kane, go ahead.
No, I actually, yeah, I just wanted to, well, first of all, the name of the documentary is The Big Payback. But secondly, I was wondering if we had time for Janet's question. I don't know.
I was just about to say, Janet, I saw that you had your hand up, and would you mind taking us home here?
Okay, yeah, I was just going to say something about the question, the part of the question that talks about other people who do not want reparation. Yeah, like, of course, like, there are people who want reparation, and there are, of course, people who do not want reparation. I think they call them like, we have the nationalists, the cultural nationalists, we have the people who do not want, and we have the ones who want. Yeah, so that was what I wanted to say, basically.
And to clarify, do you mean people within Black communities that don't want reparations, or people within white communities that don't want reparations?
Of course, like there are people within Black communities who do not want reparation. Yeah. Right now, I'm doing a studies, but not in the, it's not about the US. It's about like Nigeria, but actually like reparations from the UK and all. And of course, there are like people who are interviewed, and they are Nigerians, and they say, well, no, we do not want like. So I feel like basically it's like so. Some people are just so
I'm
like
curious to hear
indifferent.
what those arguments are. What are those arguments? I'm very curious.
Some people are like quite indifferent. Basically, they don't like. Yeah, but some people are like, yeah, we want it. But some people are like, no, like. So I feel like it's like an individual thing, basically. Even like people from the source community, even some of them do not want. Yeah.
I do feel like, and maybe this is resonant to this really fascinating dynamic that you're talking about. I mean, some of the pushback that we have gotten has been from people who do think that the push for Black reparations is divisive in a way that prevents Black people from joining projects, different kinds of political projects, with people who might be opposed to reparations, who might see it as this kind of racialist project or something. Precisely, in part, I think, because of the idea that reparations problematizes, as Kane was saying, problematizes and disrupts rather than redeems the idea of the idyllic, idealized nation state. And so that kind of disruption also has certain political implications on the ground that I think some folks who are against the push for reparations want to hold on to. The problem, though, is that, or a problem, at least in the U.S. context, is that I think that those efforts are often very self-defeating. I mean, for example, a lot of this anti-DEI stuff, if you kind of go back a few generations, began with this critique of the 1619 Project. And a lot of people on the left and other kind of liberals were against the 1619 Project, in part because they very naively didn't understand that the critique of the 1619 Project was going to be the kind of launching pad for a fascist assault. Now, history shows this happens over and over again, but the attempt to fight reparations is often the attempt to engage in historical amnesia. So it's not surprising that this happened. But I mean, no one could have predicted maybe the extent to that. But yeah, I think nationalism is very central to the attempt, both on the left and on the right, to fight against reparations in the U.S. context.
Yeah, definitely. And I think in the US, there is sort of like this question is kind of like just consistently polled, and I think the latest numbers were about like 3/4 of Black Americans were in support of approved of reparations. So I think it's very interesting to think with your sort of answer or your question, to think through sort of this with a sort of transnational kind of lens, and to think about like how reparations is being spoken about in different spaces, and also the sort of the different histories and sort of like ways in which things things are connecting to different populations, as to that can lead to sort of these very sort of sort of disparate conclusions about sort of what is a remedy, and sort of if a remedy is needed in one space versus another space.
Thanks for that, Kane. And oh, sorry, I was just say really quickly, can you repeat the title of that documentary that you mentioned? Somebody asked about it in Q&A.
The Big Payback. the big payback. It's criminal that I've taught it. Criminal that I missed it. And thanks, Kane, for following up on that. And one other quick thing in perhaps in closing here is that there's really sophisticated polling data out of Evanston, Illinois now. So of people, hey, do you support reparations? Yes or no? They did polling within Evanston prior to the reparations initiative passing, and then after the reparation initiative, and disaggregated it by race and everything else, right? And the fascinating finding that they came across, and it really shouldn't fascinate, or really shouldn't like surprise us actually, is that support for reparations grew after it was put in place, right? So people that were opposed to it, the idea before it happens, once they see it in action, and you've got these stories circulating around the press of, Black grandmas that just got $25,000 and fixed their leaky kitchen so there's not mold and their grandkids can come over and not get sick. When you hear that, people, white and Black, dramatically increase their support for reparations within. And the reason that shouldn't surprise us is look at, I always give this example, look at support or unsupport for interracial marriage, for example, right? When it was made legal in the United States, the majority of Americans, Black and white, were against interracial marriage. And that number has steadily increased over time as it's kind of become policy, and interracial marriages have happened. People have Black nieces and nephews, white nieces, nephews, grandmas, and everything else. And people have their support has changed over time. That's probably exactly what's going to happen with reparations. There's going to be a group of people that oppose it, people in favor of it. The activists are going to win, and then people are going to come along as time goes on. That's pretty much how things have been. Any demand for Black freedom has always been controversial. It's always been divisive. It's always been tried to get shut down. And then over time, there's been a change and a kind of softening, as it were. And that's probably, if reparations does happen, that's probably, I think, the trajectory it'll take.
Thank you so much for that. It's not every panel that you get, especially ones like this, where you get to end on something of a hopeful note. So let's go ahead and call it there. We are a little bit past time here. I just wanted to, from the bottom of my heart, thank everybody here who's participated. Thank everybody in the audience who's joined us. I hope, and it seems from both the questions and some of the comments that we've been getting, that everybody is so appreciative of the work that not just you three have done, right, but all of your interlocutors, the community effort around this and its implications, I think, well beyond memory studies, but also for a formation like that. So thank you all so much again. We so appreciate you joining us, and look out for that next dMSA event, whenever it comes up. So thank you so much.